Thank you, Dan. Fascinating questions, comments.
I have just a short question. How do you encourage your primates to do these things? How do you reward them?
Yeah. It is a very important question. They are rewarded for completing the correct sequence in the case of this spatial sequence that you saw, or they are rewarded for pressing the correct outlier in the case of the 6 shapes and pointing to the outlier. So there is always a reward. They don't work for nothing. Although they like to come, apparently, in the case of the baboons, they like to come to these booths a little bit like video games, for distraction. But there is always a food reward. Yeah. In the case of the monkeys in the fMRI scanner, the reward is for fixating. So they are taught that if they keep fixation to a particular point and don't move their eyes, which means they are concentrated, then after 3 seconds, they will get a reward. Okay, so this way we can channel their behavior, but it's minimal behavior. And during this period, we can project them shapes or sequences. Of course, this raises the issue, if they were better motivated, maybe they would learn better. So that's a limitation, I think, of these studies. It's very hard to know if the failures of monkeys might just mean that they were not motivated enough. Right? However, then we have experiments such as the ones where chimpanzees were raised in families, very young chimpanzees, still very flexible, and yet they were unable essentially to acquire any form of language. Any form of combinatorial language. They learned the indices, as I showed you, but not the combinations. But the motivation question is, of course, very hard to solve.
Stan, do you have any idea of what structural features had been added to the human brain that allowed this sort of symbolic representations?
That's, of course, a huge question. Yeah. Well, we have a number of leads. One is, of course, brain expansion that you discussed, but it's not expansion anywhere in the brain, expansion of associative areas, in particular prefrontal cortex, and parietal association cortex and temporal association cortex. And these are exactly the areas that we see. Depending on the content, we see parieto-frontal networks, temporal frontal networks for music or for language. So always there is this back and forth between frontal cortex and the posterior region, or one or several posterior regions. And one very important change in the human brain is asymmetry and expansion of the arcuate fasciculus. This very big fasciculus of fibers that connects the frontal lobe to the posterior part of the brain. So I think these are quite plausible changes. This would allow the information to circulate and perhaps create recursion. And finally, we know that the neurons in Broca's area and probably in the entire frontal lobe in humans, prefrontal lobe, have larger arborescences. They seem to have capacity for more synapses. I think you know more than me about that, but I'm reading these papers. And there is even the idea that perhaps a single neuron with its branches, this is from the work of Idan Segev, the computations inside the dendrites of the human neurons may be more complex than in non-human primate neurons, because there are more combinations, basically. So maybe even a single neuron already has a slightly higher computational ability to combine information non-linearly. I'm struck by the fact that in artificial intelligence, they all use linear neurons, linear with a threshold, so they sum their inputs. And we know that this is completely false from the point of view of biology, that neurons don't just sum their inputs, and in particular, human neurons seem to have these nonlinear computations.
Well, thank you. Marcello?
In our tradition, we say another characteristic of human being is the freedom, liberté. You have some possibility to explore this other dimension, not only knowledge, but also freedom in the comparison with.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult question. I think that because we have this huge space of possibilities, we may say that we have more freedom. there is a greater range of representations in the human mind, I think. I remember when I talked to David Premack many years ago, who is a specialist of chimpanzees, and who raised one of these chimpanzees, Sarah, and he said, if you ask a chimpanzee to jump across a stream, he will do it in one way. But if you ask humans, they will do it in 20 different ways. So maybe this is a form of freedom, yes. At the same time, freedom is difficult because the brain is a physical system, and the sequence of activity determines, I think, who we are. So do we have freedom? That's another discussion.
Just a larger scale of options.
So your study really reinforces the idea of typical Skinnerian conditioning, that if you reward the right solution, they will do that, but they're not inventive. You understand?
That's a bit reductive, I think. I'm not sure if I would agree with this statement. Monkeys have a space of representations in their mind. It's just that the space is much more limited because it does not involve this explosion by combinations, basically.
Sure, but I mean, you know, historically, a dedicated Skinnerian would say we learned language via positive reinforcement, which we don't.
Yeah, exactly.
And so your study really reinforces my view of how Skinner's view is gone.
Yes, yeah. I think it's gone since 1957.
Yes.
And what I showed is very much along the Chomsky program.
Yeah.
The only thing is that in terms of evolution, we need to find a way for the primate brain to have changed probably progressively, not immediately. In that respect, I disagree with Chomsky that we should just have a sort of click and that's it. It's interesting that it should be a change, not in one area.
Yes.
I think this is the new thing that we need to consider. Perhaps it's a change, as I said, in the neurons or maybe in the laminar structure of cortex. I think we will discuss that in a second, right? That could have affected a large number of areas of the brain.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, still back.
Microphone, please.
I have, in fact, let's say two questions. The first is about a question of nomenclature. You said at the beginning of the talk, a symbol is a system. But if I understand well, by system, you mean the reversibility of one symbol. No, the issue of nomenclature, in a sense, is of interest to establish bridges between different disciplines. When we talk about a symbol and a symbolic system, we mean that it's extremely difficult to conceive a system of symbols in which you only have one symbol, because in a system of symbols, very often, let's say, the symbols entertain a relationship between them, and there is not or a very low overlapping between the meaning that are behind the symbol. While when you say a symbol is a system, in a sense, you put some, so there must be some way of putting the two things together.
I'm sorry if I was not clear. I did not say I think a symbol is a system. I want to say, just like you said, that we can speak of a symbol only if there is more than one and if they combine together. So there are two properties of a symbol. One is this bidirectional association. The second is belonging into a larger system where you can compute inside the system and get the results.
But in your lives, a symbol is a system.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The second is, of course, a very strong point of your presentation is focusing on the peculiarity, human peculiarity of that. So should we think that this is so particular, so human, that it should come as a sort of immediate mutation, or we can conceive intermediate stages of this development that would lead to this human peculiarity?
Well, this is all speculation, but one possibility is that the humans have evolved what I call the global workspace system that puts together information from any different source. What's very spectacular about language is that it allows you to speak of any aspect of your mind. And this means collecting information from all sorts of places in the brain and bringing them to this one system. So an interesting possibility is that other animals may have a more modular organization, and perhaps within one of these modules, there is already the need for a recursive structure. I'm thinking of visual representations, because you do need to represent, for instance, body parts, one hand attached to an arm, attached to a shoulder, attached to the body. So maybe you already have, in this respect, if you understand a body, you need to have some kind of tree structure, right? And maybe this evolved inside this system and then became exapted and diffused to the rest of the brain.
Yeah, but I mean, for example, what would be the role of education and brain plasticity in that process within each population? For example, the say different, I mean, that you saw with the ovaimba, that in fact do not really seems to fit the general pattern. If you were exploring these in many different cultures and different populations, perhaps you would find that in fact there are many ovaimba around in which we do not exactly find what you see in modern. I mean, in West, one of your Westerns is a wonder. I'm not saying that you would, but of course the education and the way in which you are trained may change during your lifetime, and particularly in the early age, when you are young, of course, during the development of the brain, the creation of those networks. So those networks would not be exactly the same.
Sure.
In different cultures.
My prediction would be that the potentiality is the same, but of course, different cultures have or have not explored and discovered certain regularities. So some cultures don't have counting. I've studied them, you know, they are quite different, but they still have the same primitives. And the prediction would be that in just a few minutes, you should be able to explain to them the new combination that you are proposing. And that, I think, is the way we do with the Himba or the Munduruku in the Amazon. We bring them a new test, and in just 2 minutes, if the test is well done, they understand what it's about, and they discover about 2 squares, for instance, which they had never thought before. But they have the potentiality because they are human.
Yeah. So thank you.